Okay, now we got about a minute. I got you there, Richard. Richard?
Yeah, I was on mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah. When he says Franklin and this guy he's talking about
Franklin
UK.
cover up.
Yeah, go
Read the
ahead.
book by John Camp.
We got like a minute before we go to the first break. Explain what he's talking about when he says Franklin.
John DeCamp was, I believe, a senator from Nebraska, if I'm recalling correctly, and he wrote a book called the Franklin Cover-Up. It's connected to the Franklin scandal, and it named a lot of higher-up people in the Reagan and Bush administrations that were involved in child sexual abuse. And this carried into the Washington Times, June 29th, 1989, front-page story, Cowboys took midnight tour of the White House.
Okay, now this is when I was coming in. You know, as a young man, you start to realize how bad they are. This is the kind of information that was coming out. And what do you do with it? Even if you believed it and you had proof and you didn't see it on the mainstream media, the media is so last century, and it gets buried. And then it's another generation and another generation and another crop of legislators in government. We'll talk.
Hey, Glenn, how you doing? Good morning. You had that question about where did these Podesta emails originate, and from the official story that I understand, Podesta was sent a phishing email for him to change his password, and he actually turned his password over to likely the people who leaked the emails to WikiLeaks. And then at the end of October, you had former psychological warfare officer and Department of State worker bee Steve Pieczenik come out in a video and say that he and others in the intelligence community were behind it, not the Russians. So, I mean, you could take that with a grain of salt, but Pieczenik was a serious Cold War player. He was an Operation Gladio player who had overthrown countries. He was involved in the 1976 assassination of Aldo Moro by the Red Brigade's proxy. So there was a whole bunch of information that kind of came out about it. I'm not claiming any of that was true. I'm just saying these are the pieces to the puzzle that are laying out there for people to inspect and think about on their own.
So what's your opinion of Gunderson, Richard? What do you know about him?
Well, I've only seen his videos. I've seen accounts from both sides. So I've seen Gunderson's presentations, and I've seen people claim that Gunderson was actually involved with that stuff. But then you got to step back, and it's like I would ask the question, do I have any other context for this? Yes, there's a group of people that are like CIA people that go in. It's called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
Yeah.
So so the CIA has a group of people that go after people that make these claims, and they say, oh, these are false memories that you guys have created, right? Because when we made State of Mind, the psychology of control, we went through different cases. Like there was the Finders case, and there's Operation Midnight Climax. And so Operation Midnight Climax is where the CIA is setting up these rooms with double-sided mirrors, and they're filming people for blackmail. There's the Finders case. You have to ask, what's the motivation of the child abuse there? You've got DynCorp sexually abusing and doing human trafficking over in Afghanistan and maybe in Iraq. It's all over the place. And they were part of Computer Sciences Corporation, which was an NSA contractor. So what's the motivation there? Right. And then you've got Jimmy Savile, this other thing that happened over in the BBC. And what's the motivation there? Was Jimmy Savile trying to live longer? Was he doing it for blackmail? Is it just because that's the royal culture that would tie into the occult? So there's all these different situations where the child sexual abuse actually has happened in history, and you can study it. And then you have to, kind of categorize that and say which of these patterns might apply. But I guess my question is, like, you need to present to people at home. It's like, what is the evidence of children being killed through the Podesta emails situation, for instance? That helps people actually get over the hump. Or you just stick to teaching them about these patterns in the past, and then they can, start to think for themselves on the current events.
All right. Now, one thing that in the break we're getting off into, I'll have Richard Grove go ahead and explain this one thing, this false memory group or whatever, and then we're going to get Glenn's comment. But tell the audience what we're talking about, Richard.
Well, when Kevin and Cole and I were writing the State of Mind, the Psychology of Control, which came out in 2013, a couple of the different case studies that we were looking at were the CIA's Operation Midnight Climax, which, if I recall correctly, the CIA had set up a safe house in San Francisco with a double-sided mirror behind which you'd have CIA guys and video cameras. They would then dose people with LSD, bring them into this hotel room, and get them in compromising positions. So in that operation, the goal was blackmail. there was another case called the Finders case where kids were being kidnapped and abused from all across the country. And that case, the motivation was still questionable. The more recent ones were DynCorp, which was a military contractor that Cynthia McKinney famously confronted Donald Rumsfeld and Joint Chiefs of Staff General Myers on in front of Congress. She questioned him about the insider trading on 9/11, the multiple war games, the $2.3 trillion missing the day before 9/11, and why DynCorp, which was convicted of sexual trafficking of women and children, was still getting Pentagon money. Now, that still goes on. If you just search DynCorp plus Afghanistan plus sexual trafficking, you're going to see there's still recent. And so is that for money? Is it for blackmail? Is it for the occult? Is it for part of the culture that goes on in Afghanistan? There's many different reasonings that attach to all these different cases. You've also got the BBC case, the famous case that went on for like 3 decades with Jimmy Savile. And, the curious instance where the director general of the BBC, Mark Thompson, then became the current CEO of the New York Times. So there's all these different layers to it. Sexual abuse of children goes on through history. There's many different motives attached to it. And then you have to learn the different case studies and say what applies here. What evidence is there that children are being killed in relation to these Podesta emails, for instance? So I was just trying to explain, the other one that you mentioned when we came back was the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which was a CIA kind of covert operation to go in and take people who are victims and espousing that they've been victimized, that their memories weren't real. And you had a bunch of MK Ultra related people that were, basically manipulating the minds of victims to make them believe that they weren't victimized. There was a documentary back in the 90s, probably. There was Discovery Channel. It was called The Conspiracy of Silence. I thought that was the documentary that involved Boys Town, which was a Catholic, a boys' orphanage that had tunnels that went over to this other property where these kids said that they were abused.
So this is, I think it's of interest that Richard was one of the first guys I thought of. We have James Corbett. He's out doing the Corbett Report. He's kind of focused on this too. Okay, let's go find it. He goes, damn, I went over looking to debunk a lot of this stuff, and I'm like, damn, but you got to get names right. You got to, they send you down rabbit holes that aren't true. So Richard's going to, I don't so much want the Pizzagate thing. I mean, we're going to find out more and more about whatever. But I'm really looking for more context and also what we shouldn't be doing. Be careful not to lose your credibility. Be careful not to be one that's saying stuff that isn't so, because that one little thing will taint the 90% that is. So I'm going, Richard, how you think we should approach this? Go for me, man.
Well, I think we should have a goal of avoid, let's just, let me just back up and start with a personal story. I went to the gun club with my brother-in-laws yesterday, and one of my brother-in-laws had never been to fire a firearm in his whole life. So I said, hey, here's the goal coming out of here. We'll have a good time if none of us gets hurt, right? So let's just go here, and if nobody gets hurt doing this, we're going to have a good time. So the same way with research, what you want to avoid is don't get hurt. You don't want to jump to conclusions, because that's what can hurt your integrity. This is the thing that really can do a lot of damage. And, you can have a lot of good things that you've researched, and you make one misstep, and that can ruin it's like a domino effect. So the one thing you want to avoid is jumping to conclusions or stating things that there's no objective evidence that you can point to so other people can understand. That's where the break in communication happens. So, I just want to talk a little bit about a method of researching so that you can actually learn stuff instead of jumping to conclusions. And the method I find most effective in my daily work is being incredulous. I'll see something on Twitter or on, being passed around, and I'll say, that can't be true. And instead of just saying that can't be true and ending it, I will use this search engine and I will start searching. So, for instance, I heard InfoWars talking about this Washington Post article with Tony Podesta. And I was like, that can't be true. And then I started searching for it. And sure enough, it's no longer on the Washington Post. And I said, well, maybe it doesn't exist. And the link that InfoWars is passing around was to like an internet archive type of site, but I had not been familiar with it. So I wasn't sure what the veracity of their content was. What I was familiar with was this thing called Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. So I took the URL that used to be a Washington Post story, I plugged it in, and sure enough, here's all these dates that the article was archived. Well, let me check out this 2013 entry. Sure enough, it's an actual article, Married with Art, about Tony and Heather Podesta. And you can read through there, and it's got some information in there. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Why would the Washington Post not have this on their site anymore? Like, this is an article they generated. They spent budget money to do this. And if it was inaccurate, they should have printed a retraction, not just taken it off their site. And then a few days later, so I tweeted it when I found it. I was like, oh, this is valuable. Check this out. And I'm not making any judgment. I'm just saying this is an artifact of evidence that exists. It was generated by the Washington Post, and it's about this character who's the brother of the character that's in the Podesta email leaks from WikiLeaks. And I'd been busy searching the Podesta email. So let me back up another step. WikiLeaks is a clearinghouse for information that is leaked by whistleblowers. So they receive document dumps from whistleblowers, and they verify them somehow, and they publish it. In the past 10 years, they've dumped out 10 million documents, and they've never been proven to be releasing fake documents. So they have a track record of integrity. So they were releasing these emails from John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, and he was also Obama's chief of staff. If you look up John Podesta on Wikipedia, he's a long, sordid history in Washington as being one of their worker bees.
I want to get into that a little bit, too, because that would scare the crap out of me where his pedigree comes from. But, okay, continue.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was, as day by day, as these Podesta emails were being released in chunks of like 5,000 emails a day over 40 days or 36 days, I'm going through and searching Rothschild and Soros and, the usual suspects. And so Tony Podesta, I came to learn, was one of the most, or still is, one of the most powerful lobbyists in Washington, D.C., and some of his clients are like the Saudis. So that made me think, Hillary Clinton is close to Huma Abedin, who is potentially a Saudi spy of some variety. And, there was the whole investigation into her emails, and the guy from the Justice Department, who is the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, that was looking into this, that was leading this investigation. You find out from the Podesta emails is John Podesta's good buddy, Peter Kadzik. So there's all these little interesting things that, are meritorious, are evidentiary, should be served up by journalists at the Washington Post and New York Times, but they won't touch any of this stuff. So it was a real high tide for independent journalism, for citizen journalism. You had the power to go to just search John Podesta email leaks, and you'll find the Podesta emails on WikiLeaks, and it's got a Google type search interface where you just enter in a search word, and it'll show you all these emails that turn up with that key phrase or those words. And so it was a chance that it was like an equal footing, flat ground for everybody to be able to just search and be like, oh, what's going on with this? Peter Kadzik, what emails is he involved with? Like, what's the conversations between him and Podesta? Oh, Podesta says Peter Kadzik's a good guy. He once, quote, got me out of prison, end quote. Well, this is the guy that's supposed to be investigating Podesta's, team, the Clinton team. And so that's like a conflict of interest. So there's all these interesting things that were in there that weren't being discussed by the so-called mainstream media, who instead of doing investigative journalism decided years ago to stop investigating, to save that money, and just basically become a PR mouthpiece for the Clinton campaign. Now, that's not just a statement I will make. After the break, I'll break it down and show you how the Clinton campaign actually usurped all these different mainstream media outlets, and they became the mouthpieces. Well, the point I had made earlier about the Tony Podesta article disappearing off of Washington Post, and I found it on Internet Archive. And so I tweeted that out on November 5th. So I said, okay, I found the artifact. Here it is. It's been cached by Internet Archive over these many years, and here it is. So my Twitter is more like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, because I know it's all archived in the Library of Congress, and I figure if we don't overcome this corruption right now, people in the future are still trying to figure out what's going on, what's been deleted in the meanwhile, and I'm just trying to leave a trail of breadcrumbs. Well, 3 days later on November 8th, I went to click that link again and share it with somebody, and that link's gone. And I said, hey, how did this article that's been on Internet Archive for years suddenly go missing? Now, I could jump to conclusion and say, well, someone at the Washington Post made some calls and they got it deleted. But then I was trying to dig into like what actually happened with this deletion. And it says that the robots.txt, which is it's a document that encapsulates all the links on a website. It had been changed. So somebody changed the robots.txt file. Now, I only know this because I had to reformat mine for my own website a couple weeks ago because I continually have hackers trying to break in and stuff like that. So I had been delisted from Google, where I used to have 3,000 pages listed, and then it went to 0. And I was like, hey, what happened there? So someone went into my robots.txt file and they said, don't archive any of these links. Right. So then I had to go in and change that. So the change they made could be innocent, or it could have been purposeful. Without going the extra step and actually making some calls or getting more information, I don't know. So I'm fine with having a question mark there. I don't need to know right now. I'll find that out eventually, but I'm not going to jump to a conclusion and say somebody made the call. Tony Podesta called Internet Archive and said, delete this document, right? So I can't go there because there's no evidence or artifact of that. So let's leave that aside, because that was a part where I was incredulous. I did some searching. I found it. Then that document disappeared. It's still available on another archive site. So if people want to read it, that's available out there. I did tweet that link. It's a .io link. It's not a Internet Archive link.
See, this is why there has to be a decentralized, uncensorable internet. This is for exactly this kind of stuff. When it's important, it goes away. If you look up Wayback Machine on Wikipedia, legal status, I want to read these couple sentences here and you kind of get an idea. In Europe, the Wayback Machine could be interpreted as violating copyright laws. Only the content creator can decide where their content is published or duplicated, so the archive would have to delete pages from its system upon request of the creator. The exclusion policies for the Wayback Machine may be found in the fact section of the site. The Wayback Machine also retroactively respects robots.txt files, i.e. pages that currently are blocked to robots on the live web temporarily will be made unavailable from the archives as well. So there is an automated system to make sure even the Wayback Machine, even where you have these archives, even where all this stuff's supposed to be, and it's gone. How far off am I?
Well, and it can also happen unintentionally. For instance, up until last couple weeks, you could go back and see my website in its former stages all the way back to 2006. So you could see it for the last 10 years. And that was useful to me because I've changed the name of the website. I've changed some of the documents and structures. I've had many different WordPress formats and templates that I've used on there. So it was useful to me. And I was just talking to a buddy of mine in the last couple of days, and he's like, did you know that your site got wiped too? It's no longer back there. And I was like, oh, that sucks, because now like the reference links that I had to that no longer work. And it's not because, well, I mean, I guess it could be because I updated my robots.txt because I had been hacked, but it's like that wasn't intentional on my part. So then it's like it happens for a variety of reasons, not all of which are nefarious. But in the case of the Tony Podesta article, it starts out with it being taken off WashingtonPost.com without a retraction, and that was what gained my interest, and I was kind of incredulous. So the incredulousness plus searching leads to learning. That's kind of the point I was trying to make there. Now, another example, let me just take a separate example from the Podesta leaks. There's an email from Cheryl Mills, who is involved with the Clinton Foundation and the State Department and like a Clinton crony, to Hillary Clinton on 2009, June 6th. And the title, the subject is DynCorp, DYNCORPS, post story, second shoe to drop. And it's an unclassified U.S. State Department case, and it gives a case number. But let me just get down to the text, because this is another point where people should be incredulous. It says, folks, you may recall an April 17th Post story, so Washington Post story, on the problems with DynCorp in Afghanistan, which focused on a suspected drug overdose death, breakdown of internal controls within the company, and actions the U.S. government and the firm were taking. The other issue is the colossal error in judgment of one of the contractors, and then it basically goes down to the Post is now looking into the dancing boy. So this is getting into a story where, let me just scroll down a little bit further to give you the summary. According to the reports, on the week of April 13th, DynCorp regional commander from Kunduz, Afghanistan, Flint Chambers, allowed his men to hire a 15-year-old boy dancer to do tribal dances at a DynCorp party on the training site. Some 15 or so DynCorp employees in attendance pulled out a single chair and had the boy do mock lap dances. This was supported and captured on video. The video shows DynCorp employees putting dollar bills in the boy's waistband as they would do to a stripper's garter. The revelry lasted about 45 minutes. So this is not just a claim in a WikiLeaks email. from Podesta emails. It's also supported by video. It's supported by a Washington Post story, and take that with a grain of salt because Washington Post is Operation Mockingbird. That's a CIA project. But the fact that there's video of Pentagon contractors having a 15-year-old boy lap dance for soldiers that's getting money stuffed in his underwear, right? And it says no sex took place. Well, that's a claim that's unsupported because it might have gone on outside of the video piece that's a piece of evidence, right? So I would be incredulous and say this doesn't exist, except I already know from history that DynCorp in 2002, 2003 had been charged with sex trafficking of women and children. And this is something that has historical precedent. And there's evidence supporting it and victims and charges.
Oh, hey, Gus, once you go over the edge in the hole, you fall. And you got to make sure you either got a rope or an understanding, a flashlight, something. Well, it's our flashlight. Richard Grove, tragedyandhope.com. We'll be right back.
I've been told no in many different ways.
Okay. One thing I did want to get into is the timing of the proof of life with Assange, Kerry's link to Franklin. I think that's interesting. You know, Kerry's Secretary of State, and he was at the middle of all this Franklin stuff back in the day, wasn't he?
He was certainly in the storm, if not the center of it. And he was also on the, if I remember correctly, Tower Commission that investigated Iran-Contra. And the end of the Iran-Contra report says in Latin, who will watch the watchers?
Yeah.
So, you know, the people that were actually investigating these things back in the day were like, hey, who's watching the watchers? Like there's, you know, and Poindexter from Total Informational Awareness, like he made his bones back in the time of Iran-Contra and the Enterprise. So there's a lot to this, and the whole Afghanistan thing. It's like, first off, you know, they'll claim that the Afghans or the Saudis, like, you know, they
dancing boys.
The dancing boys are part of their culture, right? Well, then you get into what is the British history with Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan prior to U.S. involvement in any of these things, because they make it today. It's like, oh, the United States is over there and it's the longest war and all this stuff. It's like, hey, the United States didn't invent these situations. They just took over responsibility for them because the British had the first, second, and third Anglo-Afghan wars over there. And they seem to have picked up a little bit of that culture when you study the spy culture of Britain and MI6 and its proclivity to use homosexual spies for purposes to blackmail and honeypots. Kim Philby et al., Cambridge 5, right? So there's all these layers of history that we're not exposed to in America, as far as like who was St. John Philby and what was his role in setting up the Saudi regime in the first place, and was he ever accused of sexual abuse of children and boys? Is that in the files? Because after MI6 says that St. John Philby, Kim Philby's dad, was ex MI6, he was still on MI6 payroll for 5 years. So there's a level of the intelligence community in the Anglo-American establishment that has approved of things like this in the past. So that's why DynCorp is like not a new precedent. It's just a continuing precedent that happened to get caught because people had a video camera. You know?
All right, so where do you want to go when we come back? Can we go back to Franklin and Kerry or Iran-Contra?
Let's just get to, proof of life with Assange, the possibility of, WikiLeaks being compromised, because up until, like I said last Wednesday, with Assange being MIA for 54 days, I said they probably renditioned him or he's dead. But then we had this supposed audio that comes out over the weekend. I don't take that as a proof of life, but I did listen carefully, and it does sound like Assange's, intonation and cadence. But I also know that there's software that's been available to the government, at least for the last 17 or 18 years, that can mimic that. Right. So, again, I can't be 100% sure because I'm just a dude sitting in my office looking at this stuff. I'm not feet on the street. I haven't been to the Ecuadorian embassy. I haven't shaken Assange's hand,
But they've asked for proof of life, and WikiLeaks has done nothing for.
I've asked them too, Glenn. I've asked them 20 times in the past month. I'm like, they're saying how they're the biggest charity now and they're bigger than Oxfam. I'm like, that's all great. Can we get proof of life? And then they're like, oh, we got this and that. I'm like, that's great. Can we get proof of life? And then they responded last week and they said, stop asking for proof of life. we don't have physical access, and they referred me to, they referred everybody to like the guy who runs the embassy. And I was like, right there, that's WikiLeaks talent. Like, who's running WikiLeaks? If they don't have any contact with Assange and they can't get somebody like to use a camera phone while he's on the phone with people.
Back. Here we go.
That's amp.lrn.fm. Roads? It's the Ernest Hancock Show. Where we're going, there aren't any roads.
Okay, I'm very, this is just the beginning. This is the beginning of the beginning of the beginning. It's not the, beginning of the end of it. It's the end of the beginning. I'm wanting to make sure that we have a better understanding of what's going on in context. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Now, the one thing Richard wants to make sure that we get to is Assange. He's gone for, almost a couple of months. And you're going, okay, what up with that? And why? And proof of life, and kind of the responses were weird. So, Richard, help me out. Richard Grove from tragedyandhope.com. Help us understand what's going on.
Well, I think first, the thing that people should just keep in mind or just consider, because I'm not an authority on anything. I don't seek to be an authority. I don't want to do your thinking for you. I have a hard enough time just thinking for myself, man. But I like to keep a level of skepticism, a healthy level of skepticism, insofar as all these events. So you have to put yourself in Assange's position. If you were trapped in the Ecuadorian embassy for the past 4 years, wouldn't you want people to kind of know on a regular basis that you're okay, you're still alive, keep contributing to WikiLeaks, this sort of thing? And for him to go missing in action for like 54 days straight without a real proof of life since this incident where he supposedly had launched these hash tweets where he's like, hey, here's how to unlock these secret files. And prior to that, there was an attempted assassination of him where it went on for like 2 hours before the cops who were down the block responded to it. It's like, that's like an approved, allowed attempt on his life. I would think that he would be a little bit more like, I don't know, wanting to be in the public eye, and let people know he's all right. So when he's gone like 54 days last week without a proof of life, I had thought at that point, I said, okay, so he probably got renditioned back in October. They've had a changeover in who's running WikiLeaks. And if he's not already dead, they probably renditioned him to a black site. Maybe John Kerry took him with him down to the South Pole. That'd be a good place to control his ability to communicate with the rest of the world, right? So this past weekend, Ernie had contacted me last week. He's like, hey, come on the show Monday. Let's talk about this. But over the weekend, there was an audio recording of Julian Assange allegedly having this discussion with this group of people who were in the Middle East. And they were having a conference, and he spoke at the conference telephonically. And I said, this is great, except it's not really a proof of life. And you're telling me that you can't get like somebody with a camera phone in the Ecuadorian embassy to like take, 30 seconds of video of him talking on the phone, go outside, upload that to YouTube, and then we have a proof of life. And we had been, we as concerned researchers had been asking WikiLeaks, hey, can we get a proof of life? Can we get a proof of life? WikiLeaks is like, hey, we're the biggest nonprofit charity now, and we're bigger than Oxfam and these other charities. And we're like, hey, can we get a proof of life? And WikiLeaks finally said last week, stop asking us for a proof of life. We don't have physical access to Assange, and you have to contact the embassy. The embassy has control of his physical presence. We're like, okay, great. Who's running WikiLeaks then? Whose tweets are we reading? If Assange isn't sending these out and you guys don't have direct contact with him and you don't seem to be too concerned to go over there and actually get it for the rest of us, like what is going on here? Then you couple that with the claims of Steve Pieczenik. And again, I don't believe everything Steve Pieczenik says, but due to his experience in the U.S. government and overthrowing regimes and Black Ops and Operation Gladio, I listen to what he has to say and I compare that to reality and see what matches up. So there's all these unknowns. And at one point I said back to WikiLeaks, I said, you guys are fanning the conspiracy because they're like, stop being conspiratorial. Because there was on 4chan, there was an anonymous WikiLeaks employee allegedly who said the day that Assange's internet went out, that they had been raided and all this other stuff. And it's like, okay, that's an anonymous person with no evidence. It's claims of testimony. And you have to wait to, if there's evidence that shows up that backs that or corroborates it, I can take it more seriously. But you consider it as, okay, there's this piece of nebulous information here. So without WikiLeaks actually refuting any of this, they allow that to continue to smolder and people grab onto that more and more. But even with this past audio recording this weekend, it's like, I would say from listening to it, it sounds like Julian Assange in his intonation and his cadence. But going back to 1999, General Carl Steiner of SOCOM's, special ops of the Pentagon, said that, they had this software that morphs voices, and they actually did a demonstration in 1999 where they imitated General Colin Powell, that they have taken over the U.S. government. So you can look that up. I tweeted it in the last week. It's on my Twitter feed, where you can see the Washington Post article from 1999 naming General Carl Steiner. And, the Colin Powell quote was something like, gentlemen, we have taken over the United States government. Right? Now, recently, Adobe, that makes Photoshop and audio and video editing software, has released a type of like Photoshop for audio recordings where you can say something and make it sound like other people. So now that this software is available to the general public, you have to consider that the government has had that for almost 20 years. So that's why I say I would believe 98% that Assange is alive and he did that actual phone call last Saturday. But 2% of me still says, hey, I recognize the nature of the covert ops that go on in this world, the capability of these people who might have a grudge against Assange to keep him from actually communicating live with the public or being truthfully represented to the public, and that these types of things go on out there. So you can't be 100% certain. I would still like to see a proof of life. I know there's a lot of other people that would like to see a proof of life. And there's still even more people that are like 100% sure that Julian Assange is live and there's no conspiracy. And I get a kick out of people who are 100% sure of things that they haven't looked at and don't have evidence for.
Well, do we have any kind of real foundational believability, credibility that Assange is what he's represented to the world? I mean,
all right, that's a great question. That is an excellent question, Ernie. So let's look at the history that I'm aware of Julian Assange. And I'm not an expert in this area. I haven't had a great deal of interest in WikiLeaks really up until the Podesta emails, the DNC leaks, the Hillary emails in the last couple of years. I didn't see or use WikiLeaks up in like when it was going on from 2007 to 2012 and he got arrested. Like I didn't even know, like I that was all like off my radar because I was stuck in 100-year-old history books. So as a forensic historian, I tend to look at what is all this information stuck in books that's not even on the internet yet. And so I was late to this party of looking into the WikiLeaks releases. Now, in the last couple of years, I've looked into this stuff, and even more so in the past couple of months. And what I can tell you is from trying to gather the information that's available out there on this nebulous character called Julian Assange, right? There's, if you want pop culture, the British made not a documentary, it's like a biopic with Benedict Cumberbatch, and he plays Julian Assange. And you can kind of tell this is a British MI6 kind of like slanted perspective, but you can get a perspective of who Assange was and is from that. Okay, so you just collect all these different pieces of information that are out there, right? There's documentaries. You can go on the Wikipedia page and start digging into the footnotes and references that are used to make that Wikipedia page. You can find out that Assange was, he grew up as part, like his mother had joined this group. Some might call it a cult that I believe went to Australia, and that all the kids in that group they had their hair dyed white, and that he became a computer hacker, and that at one point he got arrested by the government, and then he was released after he was arrested for hacking. His hacker name, if memory serves, was Mendax. So you can just start taking all this. I'm not saying believe anything I'm saying. I'm saying these are all starting points for your own education on this topic. Search Julian Assange plus Mendax. Oh, that's interesting. And then keep searching. The whole thing about learning is you cannot learn using declarative sentences that end in a period. Learning all starts with a question mark. So, learning is the answer. What is the question? What is the, identity of the time, the place, the thing, the motive, all these different things. That's the 5 W's plus how. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. What was the identity of the place? What was the identity of the person? What was the identity of the time? What was the identity of the method? These are the keys to learning that journalism used to be comprised of. And yet you can see all these multi-billion-dollar mass media outlets, you can call them the mainstream media, that don't use any of these methods of learning anymore. So we have to take it upon ourselves to start doing this for ourselves and educate ourselves, because we can be our own best experts beyond what the New York Times or Washington Post can do for us.
One thing I wanted to make sure that we didn't miss out on this cult, bleach your hair white, whatever Assange thing. And in the break, Glenn made a point that Pam Anderson, Baywatch Babe, is part of this same cult, a child of God. So give me some reference on this, Richard. What the hell is this thing in Australia?
Well, from let me try to think of where I heard this originally. I believe it was a Webster Tarpley presentation on Julian Assange, and I can't vouch for agreeing with everything that Tarpley says, but again, he's a Fulbright scholar. He speaks multiple languages. He was the investigator for the Italian government into the death of Aldo Moro that Steve Pieczenik claims to have taken credit for. So, on any given day, when you have Tarpley and Pieczenik both on the Alex Jones show, who were involved in the Aldo Moro case, and there's no questions asked to that end, it leaves me like, hey, why didn't you ask these questions? Because this is interesting. So Tarpley is a serious researcher. Like I said, there's very few people that I agree with everything they say, but I listen. I listen with an open mind, and I check what they say against reality. Tarpley, if memory serves, was doing an investigatory piece on Julian Assange. He was skeptical given Assange's background as the hacker Mendax, who was in the Child of God cult. Glenn mentioned during the break that a member of that group was also Pamela Anderson. Now, that's the first time I've heard of that, but it will be easy enough for people listening to say, oh, I wonder if that's true, and go to their favorite search engine and start looking for verifiable evidence, testimony, documents, any of this sort of thing. Was she at that place at that time? There's many different points to gain knowledge. And it doesn't do us any good to just say, oh, that's true, and let's run with it, because it might be more true than that. There might be some really interesting evidence, or there might be just a little bit of speculatory testimony, and we keep that as a question mark right now. So these are some of the resources that I figured, some of this stuff out from. You can still find some of this information referenced on the Assange Wikipedia page. And again, Wikipedia is not an authority. It is a starting point for investigation. You read the article, you see the footnotes, you click the number, it takes you down to the bottom. This is the source. You go to that source, you start to read, and you start to question and think for yourself. So this is, kind of like the missing step that I see a lot of, a lot going on out there, because there's work involved. You have to ask these questions, then you have to do some typing and clicking and reading, and then repeat that process ad nauseum until you start to find out, oh, here's the document that puts this person at this place at that time. And then you dig into it from there. One of the other things that came to mind while I was jumping up to get another cup of coffee during the break was the same day that FBI Director Comey came out with reopening the Clinton case. Now, let me just say a couple things about Director Comey. Director Comey, unlike most other FBI directors, was not an agent of the FBI. He wasn't like a field agent. He's not doing case operations. He was a lawyer. And as a lawyer, one of the things that made him qualified for the FBI director position, apparently, was his position on the board of directors of HSBC, the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. Comey was on the board of directors until he took over as director of FBI. And HSBC, the bank, has been a British money laundering operation for their opium monopoly. And the opium monopoly that HSBC comes from is hundreds of years old. So HSBC has long time been one of the top money laundering banks for drug cartels in the world. And Director Comey was a member of the board of directors. I'm not saying that's criminal. I'm just saying that's a little suspect. Also suspect was HSBC donating $81 million to the Clinton Foundation while Hillary Clinton is at State Department. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal, while Hillary was at State Department as Secretary of State, the Clinton Foundation and the State Department were one seamless entity. That's not my claim. That's the Wall Street Journal. So now that we have a little bit of idea of, the pedigree of Comey and this sort of thing, we can, start to understand some of the nuances of the situation. Now, while he's reopening the case on Hillary Clinton that makes the news that day, he also did another press conference. And the press conference was in relation to an FBI operation, a joint task force operation called Operation Cross Country 10. Now, it's Cross Country X if you're typing it into a search engine. And this was a multi-jurisdiction sting that they kind of do annually now. And it's from all these different law enforcement departments. And what they do is they go out and they bust the sex trade. They bust pedophiles, they bust pimps, they bust prostitutes, they rescue children. And there was this whole story, because again, I saw this claim and I was incredulous and said, if that happened in October of 2016, I would have heard about it. That can't be real. So then I started looking up. No, this is a real operation. They did real busts. They busted like 200 people that were working in the sex industry. They rescued, let's say, like almost 100 victims, right? And I thought, surely this must be tied into some of this other stuff that I've been hearing about in the news. And sure enough, it's probably not, because the youngest victim that they rescued, I think, if memory serves, was 13 years old. And so it seems like more of a general sweep that they do to make people think that there's something going on from law enforcement perspective to stop these DynCorp type of sexual abuse trains that have been going on for multi-decades now. So this is something that is a starting point. It's not an end point, like Operation Cross Country 10. That's a starting point for investigation. Who was involved? What did they do? What did Comey say? You can watch the press conference, and it's rather impressive given that none of us hear about it. We all heard about how he reopened the investigation into Anthony Weiner and Huma Abedin's emails on that server. And then you juxtapose the whatever 600,000 emails that they found out in 5 days had no criminal evidence to the prior investigation of Clinton emails that took years. And you're like, oh, how'd they do that? How'd they figure out that there's nothing, criminal in there? And they closed that back up right before the election. So there's all these things that go on. And you can't really hope to have knowledge about these events without using the search engines to your advantage. You're not going to, the Washington Post and the New York Times, they're not going to tell you about these things. They're not paying journalists to actually investigate these things. They're paying their writers to craft public relations stories that protect their interests. And when you look at the interests, it's like the New York Times, for instance, has majority shares owned by Carlos Slim, who's a billionaire who is a serious funder and financier of Hillary Clinton. So you can't hope for real investigative journalism to come out of an organization that's owned by people that are seeking to have a certain politician take over office to represent their interests.
Okay, one thing I want you before we get to the end of this hour, real quick, you kind of mentioned it before, but I want to emphasize a little bit more. One of the BBC guys that was kind of aware of all and he's at the New York Times. Explain that.
Okay, so the context of it is there was, I'm going to use an American metaphor. There was a Dick Clark, because Dick Clark was, a music host on TV as well as radio, and there's a lot of teenagers hanging around. So Dick Clark doesn't have anything to do with this. But there was a Dick Clark of Britain. His name was Jimmy Savile, and he was in charge. Like, his show was called Top of the Pops, and this went on from the 70s until his death in the last couple years. And it was hundreds of victims in the child sexual abuse scandal that Jimmy Savile was involved in, that the BBC knew about, that was connected to the royal family, that Savile had access to mental hospitals and was treated like a doctor and allowed in rooms by himself with victims who didn't have the capacity or the ability to report it to outside sources. So this is one of the most sordid sexual abuse scandals in history, and it was covered up for decades by the BBC. After we get back from this break, I can break down what the relationship is to the American mass media from that story.
Well, you got to wait about 8 minutes and 10 seconds because that's when the next hour starts. 6 after the hour, we'll get right to it. But in the archive, it'll be in just a blip. But we'll get back to this very issue, BBC covering up for the royal family connections that's got some other weird stuff going on. It is so much circumstantial or real evidence, or I'm not even sure where you make the distinction. Richard Grove will for us. We'll be right back. All right, now where we left off, Mark Thompson was media head over at the BBC, and then he winds up at the New York Times, and during all of this sex scandal sounds something, help us out, Richard. Explain what we're talking about.
Well, again, it's another study of being incredulous, because let's just take in relation to the Podesta emails. There was a response by the Washington City paper. I was like, okay, so this involves some Washington stuff. I expect Washington City paper will write an article on it. And maybe then Washington Post came out with an article. But then I saw New York Times writing, a refutation of this whole phenomenon. And I said, well, that's interesting, because what I'm seeing here is the New York Times, that has no relation really, like what's their interest in dealing with this, seemingly small, isolated phenomenon going on in Washington, D.C., and they're not addressing the actual facts. In fact, they use a complicated piece of sophisticated propaganda called the straw man technique, where they take a hyperbolized version, like the most unbelievable, exaggerated version of a story, and then they do that so they can easily refute it without having to address the actual topic or the facts at hand. And I said, well, that's an interesting, thing for the Washington or for the New York Times to do. Why would they be doing that? So I just, I continually have more and more questions, and then I try to learn my way out of those questions. So it wasn't my topic of focus. I was like, okay, that exists, and I got some questions about it, but I didn't really have the time because it's not on my schedule to research into that. I got other obligations. I'm trying to get productions done. And then I came across a piece of information that talked about how the New York Times CEO used to work at the BBC during the time of Jimmy Savile, and that was a well-known sex scandal that went on in Britain. So I said, well, that can't be true. We wouldn't have a British guy in charge of the New York Times. So incredulously, I start looking it up. Who's the CEO of the New York Times Corporation, the New York Times companies? And it's this guy named Mark Thompson. And I'm like, okay, so who's this guy? So I go to his Wikipedia and I start looking it up. And sure enough, he used to be not just a guy who worked at the BBC. He was the Director General of the British Broadcasting Corporation. I said, well, that's interesting. But how does this even overlap with the time of Jimmy Savile? Oh, reportedly, he was told at least 3 times in his morning briefings that Jimmy Savile was involved with the sexual abuse of children, and he had ignored it. And I thought to myself, well, what's the veracity of these claims? So then I started doing more searches. I did a Google search for Mark Thompson plus Jimmy Savile. And then I found out that basically everybody in the mainstream media, except me, because I'm not in the mainstream media, knew about this phenomenon. And I started opening all these tabs in my browser. So there's Forbes, there's Vanity Fair, there's New York Times. There's all these different mass media, mainstream media corporations that are writing articles and investigating this kind of phenomenon of what is the relationship between Mark Thompson and the Jimmy Savile case. And there was a Heat Street article that specifically went into the court documents that proved that Mark Thompson, the CEO of New York Times, had concealed information and evidence and lied about his involvement in the case. And I said, oh, why would he have to do that? And then I kept digging. What I ended up doing is, when you have all these tabs open and you're like, I just learned all this stuff, how do I share it? Oh, I can tweet these. This is what Twitter's for, in my opinion. So I must have tweeted last week 40 articles in a row that are all about Mark Thompson, the CEO of New York Times, and his relationship to the Jimmy Savile case and his relationship to BBC, and how he had not only lied and concealed information during the court case, but he had withheld some of this information during his interview process with the New York Times. So I tweeted at New York Times like, hey, how comes you don't mention any of this in the executive bio of your CEO? And then there was a journalist, Jill Abramson, who allegedly, according to Breitbart, I'll take that with a grain of salt, according to Breitbart, was looking into the CEO of New York Times, Mark Thompson's connections to the Jimmy Savile case when she was fired. Now, other people say she was fired over, pay dispute. Other people say she was fired because she was a woman. So it's hard to tell in these situations, but you're collecting the information that's out there in an attempt to juxtapose it to other information, to remove the contradictions, and to actually find the evidence, i.e. the objective pieces and artifacts that reflect what actually happened, i.e. the truth of the matter. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of comparison and contrast. It takes a lot of computation using logic and reason. But when you gather, 40 plus pieces from well-known media outlets that aren't fly-by-night, quote unquote, claims of fake news sites, right? That's what the New York Times had actually said in their refutation of this whole Podesta phenomenon. They said fake news in the first sentence. And I wondered, what kind of budget did the New York Times assign to this investigative journalist to find this out? Oh, it's not an investigative journalist who wrote the article. oh, why would someone write an article saying something's not true without a budget or the ability to investigatively, be a journalist on this situation, right? That's just somebody who wants to keep the meal ticket going. And why would a CEO or someone in the editorial room assign that as a story in the first place? So then I kept coming up with more questions than I had answers for. And that kept driving me to learn more and more about who is this guy, Mark Thompson? What was his role at the BBC? What was his relationship to the Jimmy Savile scandal? And what the relationship appeared to be through the articles that I read was his job was to keep a lid on it and to keep people from actually breaking it open during the time that Jimmy Savile was alive.
And he's taken that job in America.
Yeah. And what's the reason? There was no one in America more qualified than a British BBC guy that was used for a child sex scandal cover-up to be the CEO of New York Times Company.
If that was your freaking job description, he's the perfect guy. So that's why, so what's the proof of this? You'd have to be somewhere in some board meeting if some guy sent an email to say, hire this guy because we need some protect with code word of what. See, there's no real, it's like what you're saying. It's just another little piece of information that paints a larger picture. And I'm wondering.
Well, in his case, in the Savile case, there were victims. Okay. There was victims, there's testimony, there's evidence. And then in the court case relating to Mark Thompson's involvement, there's testimony, there's people that actually put the information about Savile in front of Thompson, and then Thompson provably didn't take any action. Now, one of the things that Thompson said in his defense was he doesn't read his morning briefings. He doesn't do that. Well, that's incompetence. Why was he still employed? Like, did he lose his job over that? Or did they just say that's okay? Because it's like after 9/11, they claimed a lot of incompetence, but everyone got promoted and nobody got fired. So I call that, like, if it's incompetence and you didn't get fired and you get promoted, that's the job description, isn't it, Ernie?
Yep.
Hillary was incompetent. She had that private service. She didn't know. She didn't intend to break the law, according to Comey. So therefore, not guilty, right? No, wait, that's not how it works. And so when the law is being bent to the point where it's broken in front of everybody and they're saying, no, it's not broken, it's our job to call that out.
There's more here. It's just more here. So we need to take on the type of investigation and not just regurgitating what somebody else said. You go, okay, why did they say it? Who said that? Who is that person? How did they get the information? Where's the supporting evidence? Where's the track record? Where's the document? That's what Richard Grove does. The New York Times, globalism, and Salzberg's letter. There's 2 points that Richard wanted to make. Go ahead and finish that, Richard.
Oh, so right after the election, the New York Times owner, or partial owner, the hereditary owner, if you will, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., published a letter to the readers. Now, this is in my Twitter feed. My Twitter is @TragedyAndHope. You can go back to about November 9th or 10th. I think this is when it's in there. And I actually have a graphic of the letter so you can click on it and read it. So it's not speculation. This is an artifact, a piece of evidence published by Arthur Sulzberger Jr. And the synopsis of it, the summary would be, they are rededicating themselves to provide truth to their readers because they hadn't been doing it. They had been providing a one-sided view in order to get Hillary into the White House. That didn't work, so they were refocusing themselves and preparing to go into the era of a Trump presidency. So I said, oh, this is interesting. They just admitted that they've been lying to their readers, but they're not going to do it anymore. Okay, so that's interesting. And I kept moving on. A couple days later, they printed an article saying, globalism, a right-wing conspiracy buoyed by Trump supporters. And I said, well, that's interesting because I happen to know that globalism or internationalism or the agenda of the New World Order goes back many, many, many years, and that credible, publishing houses and clearinghouses have written about this. Places like the Council on Foreign Relations have espoused this. So I started tweeting at the New York Times, like, oh, Council on Foreign Relations says globalism exists. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's been going on for years. Then I started finding New York Times articles where they've been talking about it. New York Times claimed in some of its articles that globalism was the role of the State Department since the 1950s. So there's contradictory evidence right there. The New York Times is saying globalism's a conspiracy theory, yet the New York Times also says globalism's going on. Well, the next week, Obama was in Europe, and he's over there meeting with Angela Merkel, and they're talking about globalism. So I'm like, hey, New York Times, which is it? Is it this thing where you're not going to lie to us anymore? Or is it the globalism's a conspiracy theory? Or is it that globalism's the goal of the Obama government and the New World Order? Like, what is it, right? And so I'm like, you guys need to get your fake news writers in communication with these people saying globalism is a conspiracy theory, because you're messing things up for yourselves, right? So the more you notice these contradictions in what they're saying, the less weight they carry in your mind as a so-called authority or an outlet of investigative journalism. So you just have to be aware of what these places are publishing, because one day they'll be like, this is conspiracy theory, because that's convenient to them trying to keep you in the dark. The next day they're like, hey, globalism exists because they want you to accept the agenda of the New World Order, right? And so there's credible resources on all of this. The New World Order is an informal term, or you can say it's a formal term, because it was used like 180 times by George H.W. Bush after the fall of the Soviet Union, when they're like, we actually have the opportunity now to get the world under a global government and for the United Nations to carry all this stuff out.
I remember when that happened. When he made that point, all of a sudden, B'nai B'rith had a big conference here in, it was like 90, 91, around in there. It was, late 91, I think, when he made that comment. And all of a sudden, they had at a Scottsdale Resort, big giant conference. Oh, it's time in the new world, and they didn't realize that the reason they had so many people there was local talk shows were, warning about it, and a bunch of people came to be against it. But I'm just like, man, they're not of the people. They're not in here. It's what they think they can get away with, and oftentimes they bite off more than they can chew. But in this time, and Daddy Bush, being a lot of people don't know, I mean, he was U.S. ambassador to China or something. Then he was director of the CIA. I don't know how the hell those two kind of meet up. And he was, part of JFK assassination of interest back in the day. I mean, this guy is, this whole Prescott Bush. I mean, there's a family. Where do you start with him? And I want to build up till we get to John Kerry and his role in a lot of, the Franklin scandal, which is he prominent figure in that. So where should we start? I mean, where do we go with the Bush line on this?
Well, I'll start with Bushes and their connections to Skull and Bones, and then I can reverse engineer from Kerry all the way back to the family history of the opium.
You got 2 minutes now,
smuggling.
and then we'll do it in the next segment also. But get us started. We get into the next segment. Go.
All right, so Prescott Bush became a useful idiot for the robber barons of the Harrimans and the Brown Brothers, which was a British bank, which became originally the Americanized version was Brown Brothers Harriman. Prescott Bush and his colleagues. There were other relatives of the Bush family involved back then as well. George Herbert Walker was one of these characters. These guys helped to support and invest their money into the nascent Nazi regime. If you get into the investigatory journalism of John Loftus, who used to work for the Department of Justice and had a cosmic top secret clearance to read the NATO records on this, Auschwitz was originally developed as an office park, an industrial park where two railroad gauge systems could meet, and it would be like a giant switching area. That was prior to World War II, but it's interesting to see that the people that were funding the Nazis also had a hand in developing that piece of real estate in Auschwitz, Poland. Then you have their cover-up of their investments in Union Banking Corporation and the Nazis after World War II, which ties back to Allen Dulles and his client Nelson Rockefeller and the Rockefeller family's investment in the Nazi regime. And that also ties into the undercurrent, which later brings George H.W. Bush in charge of the CIA after operations like Zapata.
What was Zapata?
Zapata was an operation. It goes back to that, as Nixon would say, the whole Bay of Pigs thing. And so there's Operation Operation Mongoose, Operation 40. These were prior to Kennedy's assassination, where they were basically using and training proxy assassins and doing covert business, if you will, in the national security sense. But George H.W. Bush, there was planes and boats that were bearing his signature, if you will, that were involved in some of these operations.
Come back, we'll pick it up right there. Let's go ahead and We're starting with Prescott Bush, which is, I guess we call him Grandpa Bush back in Nazi era, and we have a lot of people don't know. Hitler was freaking. Time Magazine Man of the Year kind of stuff. Ooh, that's the way you ought to do it. And there was a lot of industry that was very supportive of this, National Socialism.
And Stalin was Times Man of the Year twice.
Ooh.
So you have to look at it as, if you want to understand that whole era of the Soviets and the Nazis, one of the best resources I can recommend is it's called the Sutton Trilogy. It's 3 books by Professor Anthony C. Sutton, Antony is his first name, C. Sutton, and it's Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and Wall Street and FDR. And what he's showing you is that the international banker and robber barons were behind funding all 3 sides in developing this tripartite power structure in order to extort the peoples of the world through fear and later through which led to the creation of nuclear weapons and the whole nuclear standoff.
Is this Professor Sutton from the Hoover Institute, that guy?
Yeah, he wrote the 3 books on Soviets and the technology, Western technology development, and then the Hoover Institute for War, Revolution, and Peace was like, okay, we're all set with you, see you later, and they fired him.
Well, this is also the guy.
He's like, what did I just get fired over? And he realized that he was on to something that the Hoover Institution can't have people knowing about.
Yeah.
Well,
he was the guy that co-authored the book Trilaterals Over Washington, along with our friend Patrick Wood.
Absolutely. And he wrote a book on the Federal Reserve. He wrote like 10 books, and he wrote a book called, okay, so let's get into this. He wrote a book called How the Order, meaning Skull and Bones, Controls Education. And I spent a lot of time and money trying to find this book once upon a time. And it's a little pamphlet. So I paid $80 at one point to get I didn't know it was a pamphlet. I got this pamphlet. And then later I found out, save your money, because it's in his book, America's Secret Establishment, An Introduction to Skull and Bones, the bulk of which came from Charlotte Iserbyt's family. Her father was in Skull and Bones, and when he passed away, she had all these archives and didn't know what to do with it. So she called Anthony Sutton. He's like, oh, yeah, I can write a book about this. And that's where that book actually comes from. So there's a lot of great information out there by an author who died in the early 2000s. I think he died maybe 2001 or 2004. But his books are out there. They're available. Read them and start to piece together what's going on and compare them. There's plenty of evidence to back up and corroborate what he's saying. He's just one of the most astute and accurate and prolific writers on this topic. So getting into, let's say, Skull and Bones, his pamphlet that I bought showed how members of Skull and Bones went over to Prussia, what is now Germany, brought back to America what is called the Prussian education system, which is a way to deny individuals the ability to think for themselves and to very much be trained or programmed by the state to think in such a way as to preserve the state and to destroy individual liberty.
And this is where John Taylor Gatto comes in. This is where he started to emphasize that, okay.
Absolutely. And so now that is, I believe, Chapter 8 in Sutton's book, America's Secret Establishment, An Introduction to Skull and Bones. So you can get that book. It's like $10-15. In there, Chapter 8, Sutton tells you all about how G. Stanley Hall and these other Skull and Bones guys were involved in bringing back this Hegelian dialectic and playing both sides to control the minds of America. But that's just one part of his Skull and Bones book. So the whole Bush family, Prescott Bush, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and I believe there's another like Neil Prescott Bush, one of the scions of the family, all Skull and Bones. Well, what is this Skull and Bones secret society that's so mysterious at Yale University, founded in 1832? And when you do the basic, like what is the information available on the origins of that, let me just throw out a resource for your audience. You go to tragedyandhope.com. There's a top menu to the site. There's a main menu right in front, in the middle, but there's a top menu on the site. And one of the tabs says T&H Brain. And there's a drop down, and there's all these entries into the same network diagram, if you will. It's a visual diagram of the things that I've learned in the past 10 years, and I encapsulate them in this visual metaphor with attachments to share with people what I've learned for myself. So it's not an authority. It doesn't tell you the whole story. But as I learn things, I store them there, and it helps me remember and recall and have coherence to all these seemingly disparate things that actually do have connections. So you look up 322 or Skull and Bones, and you're going to see members of Skull and Bones. What you'll see is the origins of Skull and Bones comes from Russell and Company, which was an opium smuggling agency, a private company among America's Eastern establishment families, going back to, again, this is what Sutton's talking about in his book. So what we have to understand is one of the hidden aspects or the occulted aspects of American history is its close relationship with the British East India Company, which at the time had a worldwide global monopoly on the opium and later what is now the heroin trade that's protected in Afghanistan. The global opium trade is a monumental aspect of the banking and robber baron, the Eastern American family establishments, the money powers that are behind people like Ben Bradley of the Washington Post. He married into the Crowninshield family, and the Crowninshield family owns a bunch of publishing in America. Now you can type in Ben Bradley into the history blueprint. That's what I call my brain model. Or you can type in John Forbes Carey. There's a search box. Use it. Type in 322 Skull and Bones. These are all going to go to the same place because it ties back to the opium and the heroin trade. So Skull and Bones is a secret society that gets embedded at Yale University, a place that's one of the strongholds of the American Eastern establishment family structure. That's where they educate the future leaders of tomorrow, one of the places aside from Harvard and a couple other places. And there's feeder systems into Yale, like the Hotchkiss School and the Groton School. And you can see like these prep schools that prepare people to go into these universities that then have secret societies, like Skull and Bones is one of the many, but it's one of the more popular. And it does have a direct connection to the opium smuggling and the opium monopoly that goes on to this day. Now, John Forbes Carey was a member of Skull and Bones. And you can say, oh, well, that's just a college secret society and it has nothing to do with the real world. Well, it's not a secret society for all college students. In fact, I think you have to be a senior at Yale to be inducted into it. So you're really only there for a year, and then you're sent out into the world to play your role. The Forbes in John Forbes Carey comes from his Forbes family connection. So John Forbes Carey is part of the Forbes family. The Forbes family is one of the Eastern establishment family structures that was heavily into the opium production and smuggling and shipping and banking. His relationship to John Murray Forbes was an opium kingpin. So you can look up these people. So you go to the history blueprint, you look at John Forbes Carey, look at the names and the societies above him, start to dig in and ask the question, what are these things?
All right, when we come back, I'm sitting here while he's talking, showing you how this works. I mean, it's an amazing resource. Go check it out. TragedyandHope.com at the top right of the page, TNH Brain. We need this kind of research. That's why I wanted to talk to you, because I knew you knew a lot of this stuff to make the connections. So, all right, John Carey, Skull and Bones. You got I remember in the 2004 newspaper that we had done, we had a picture, I think Scott Beazer had done it, and it was Skull and Bones, and it had Bush and Carey next to each other in kind of a skull face, and, it's the same thing. We were going to get Skull and Bones as president either way. So I'm going, so tell us why that's a problem.
Well, I mean, you got to go back again to like, what is the history of John Carey? So when you're learning about one of these individuals, you got to look at what are the social forces and dynamics that molded John Carey to be prepared to be a so-called leader in government and to play all these powerful roles, Secretary of State, candidate for president. So you've got his involvement in Skull and Bones, and he went to Yale. But and he's also because he was in Skull and Bones, he's like in the same secret society club as George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush, if you want to go that far. So in the 80s, John Carey, and part of his rise to power was he was there to kind of help people get through the Iran-Contra era and the BCCI, which is the Bank of Commerce and Credit International, which is is the world's largest at that time. Arms trading, money laundering, drug importation. Everything was like all the undercover occult black market stuff was running through BCCI. And one of the guys who was a principal in BCCI was Clark Clifford. Now, who's Clark Clifford? Oh, in 1947, Clark Clifford's a government lawyer who writes the National Security Act. So the guy who brings us government secrecy and top secret and national security, all this stuff, he's later involved in a giant money laundering, arms trafficking, drug dealing, banking cover-up situation that John Kerry comes in and says, oh, there's nothing to see here. So John Kerry was involved in Iran-Contra. He was involved in BCCI. He was in the leader. That's called the Kerry Committee Report. It's the United States Senate Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations. And along with that, there was also the Franklin cover-up, which there's a book by the same title. Pick up the book, read the book, be skeptical, start to look up things for yourself, and build your knowledge base on these types of topics, because that's the only way you can be free as an intellectual, as an individual, is to develop cognitive liberty. That means not trusting these authorities who say, oh, John Kerry, he's a candidate for president, and there's nothing to see here. He's running against George W. Bush. It's like it's not an accident that in 2004 or whatever, you've got Kerry and Bush running, against each other, allegedly, for the presidency of the United States.
And
that's
this
like
is why
a choice
I was
between the right foot and the left
looking
foot. It's connected to it's connected to the same body.
This is why I was looking at it and going, well, of course it's going to be Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton, of course, because it's the same thing. Well, that didn't happen, and I'm wondering, how this is going to play out. The Trump, we're going to see. But it was because of this Bush-Kerry thing, and it goes back and back and back. It's like it's the same rerun. Well, what role did he play in the Franklin cover-up? And real quick, you got to, give a little bit of, 15 seconds to Franklin cover-up and why Kerry was involved in that.
Well, let me just address the book, because I have the book, and the book was written by Senator John DeCamp. So it wasn't written by some conspiracy theorist. It was written by John DeCamp, who used to work with, it was either William Colby or William Casey from the CIA. So here's a guy who worked in Operation Phoenix, who was in, I think DeCamp was in the Army. He was familiar with United States national security operations, covert operations, and he became aware of a untoward undercurrent of child sex abuse that was going on, and it covers testimony. And in that book, you'll see names like Hunter Thompson, like Warren Buffett, because some of the abuses went on at the Twin Towers apartment building in Omaha, Nebraska, that were tied back to Warren Buffett. And so when you have Bush going to Omaha, Nebraska, like Offutt Air Force Base, where Warren Buffett is holding his last annual golf tournament with a CEO like Ann Tatlock, whose offices were in World Trade Center 2, where the second plane hit, there's all these coincidences. And if you look into them, maybe they're not so coincidental, but on the surface, there's all these coincidences, and that should make you say, hey, what's up with these contradictions? These things, there seems to be a lot of these. What's hiding that we haven't been told? And that's, if you're incredulous and observant, then you can get to dig into some of these things. But to answer your question, Kerry's role in the cover-up is that, for lack of a better term, he's kind of like the lid on the pot. He's the cover on it, because it was being uncovered, and he's like, oh, there's nothing to see here. And he's the authority on behalf of the government that helps to investigate and put all these allegations to rest. So, bringing it back forward to where are we today, let's go to the theme song that you brought us in from break. It's like, Kubrick, Eyes Wide Shut. Kubrick makes this movie. He shows it to the studio heads. They say, you can't show this to people. You have to recut it. Kubrick says, go F yourself. And the next thing you know, a couple days later, I think within 48 hours, Kubrick dies. And then they recut the movie in such a way it doesn't really make sense anymore, and they release it to the public. It's still plenty creepy, but some of this, I believe, some of the scenes in the movie are actually filmed at a Rothschild property. Okay, so there's a piece of property owned by the Rothschild banking family that was used in several different movies, one of which was Eyes Wide Shut. And then you can even search on your favorite search engine, Rothschild plus Eyes Wide Shut party. You'll see these pictures from back in the 70s where it's all these ultra elite people, rich people dressed up with all these different masks and things that go on. And I'm not saying that's identical to what's being shown in Eyes Wide Shut, but it makes you stop and look for a second and say, what is going on here? I mean, even recently, there's a Jägermeister ad where it's like a guy in a tuxedo with a deer head and antlers. I said, that looks identical to some of the pictures you see from that 1970s Rothschild party. So there's all this undercurrent that's going on.
Before we run out of time, there's one thing I want to make sure we hit real quick, and we can get more into it after the show, but Scalia.
Well, wait a second. Hold on. Let's not lose this. Kerry is in London and Assange, right? Let's not lose that. That's why we're here.
True. Kerry was I don't know I didn't see him in London, but apparently he was in London. Then he was in the South Pole during this whole thing. And he was blamed as Secretary of State for cutting off, or for asking Ecuador to cut off Assange's internet access. Right.
Okay. So you're thinking that they shut down Heathrow, he's there, all of a sudden here comes Assange, that's the beginning of him not being around anymore. And then another thing was the next day, that's when that big DDoS thing happened, and that's where I heard that, I don't know, as Glenn was telling me, somebody, that's when they think they got control of WikiLeaks, was, that was a big distraction.
They changed the IP address. WikiLeaks is completely controlled by the government. I say that kind of stuff. You guys will tone it down, hopefully. But yeah, that's what happened. Then the DDoS was triggered to attempt to screw around with the dead man switch. So that's what happened.
Well, this is one thing I just thought of. I'm going, all right, they took all these WikiLeaks files and they put them out encrypted. Everybody's got them. They're downloads, done. It's on your computer. You have it. Peace. But you can't open it until you get the private key, the other side of the encryption. Well, they'll go, we'll just tweet it out. Well, if the government takes over their Twitter account and then tweets out a unlocked key, and it doesn't work, and you go, aha, you're not really them. You're just wanting to see who downloaded it. How far off am I?
Well, from my knowledge, there was the three tweets by Assange, supposedly when this was all going down. The first one said, John Kerry, and then it gave a string of numbers and letters, which was supposed to be the hash, and that comes from the SHA-256 hashing system that's part of the encryption. And if you go back, it's like, what is that? That was developed by the NSA back in the 90s. So that's the same encryption that Bitcoin uses, by the way. The SHA.
All right, Scalia. Help me out, Richard. What's up?
Scalia died, and then Hillary Clinton's daughter said, now we can repeal the Second Amendment. If you want to check into where he died, I mean, it's a ranch run by J.B. Poindexter, who's a private businessman who's been at the White House with Obama. He used to be in the Army. He was apparently at the White House to get some sort of decoration. The ranch was part of a secret society. It's like a brother or sister society to the Bohemian Grove Club. It was a hunt club. I don't know what they were hunting or what Scalia was doing there. I just, when you have a Supreme Court justice die under unusual circumstances and there's no autopsy and there's a lot of politics at play, it begs the question. Of course, begging the question is sometimes known as a fallacy, and I don't want to get on a bandwagon, which is another fallacy.
Well, the other thing was they were talking about Poindexter, and they were referencing the wrong person. There was, some kind of, you get down that trap too. Explain that.
Well, it depends on what source you read it. Some sources were more clear than others because there's John A. Poindexter, John B. Poindexter, John M. Poindexter. There's a bunch of John Poindexters in the world. Not all of them are Admiral Poindexter from Total Information Awareness or Iran-Contra. But without seeing that middle initial and actually going and differentiating and comparing and contrasting, it is easily ambiguous. And I think that was part of the purpose of the mainstream media, was to produce kind of a fake news vibe out there where people could easily jump to a conclusion and say, aha, the guy from Total Information Awareness was in charge of killing off Scalia, and there we have it, QED, when really it's not so quite easily done. Okay.
So the guy that does, John whatever Poindexter, that actually owned this property that Scalia and friends are there, and he's dead, I guess for having a place where Scalia's dead gets him an award. What were you talking about?
Well, he had already been to the... So when you just type in J.B. Poindexter and Company, you can find who's the CEO of that company. It's a guy named John B. Poindexter. He's the guy who actually owns the ranch in Texas. And when you read his Wikipedia page, you can see, where he went to school, where he served in the military. And it explains, like, he was at the Obama White House and he received such and such awards. Now, that may or may not be the end all to the story. But until I would see, like, John B. Poindexter is the son of Admiral Poindexter or something like that, I would have to say that the connection to Total Information Awareness and Iran-Contra kind of ends there, because they're two guys with, they're like homophones. They're two words that sound alike, but they're not the same.
All right. Now, one thing before we finish that we didn't emphasize enough, or just get this one guy that owns the property of the pizza place and the this ping pong play and all this kind of this little strip of property there, and the connections of just circumstantial that's really what's that guy's name? Starts with an A, and he's like
Elefantes. Elefantes. It's French for I love children. It's so fucked up.
Wow. So who is this guy?
His name is French for I love children.
All right, Richard,
I
tell
mean,
me, who is
it's
this guy?
spelled a little bit different,
All right, Richard, who is this guy?
All I know is that he's in the Podesta emails, some of the email threads. He's in there with John and Tony Podesta and Peter Kadzik, who's the Assistant Attorney General for the United States.
Okay, now
he was the 49th or something most influential person in D.C. in 2007, according to GQ or magazine or something like that. And he's a pizza shop owner. Tell me that's not fucked up.
Yeah, then the question arises, how is this guy the 49th most influential person in a city with 500, odd crooked politicians?
Yep, it just keeps getting. Well, I think we've done a pretty good job. Unless there's something else, one of you guys want to make sure you get in there. But the biggest thing that I wanted to
again, the piece about the justice in Scalia that you have to bring up, in my view, is the whole Siebel Edmonds stuff. And again, there's where she talks about. I don't know this one's actually a testimony, but she basically says that she talks all about the guy, the FBI agent, and how she worked with him, and that's where she learned all about the federal judiciary being specifically staffed with people who are vulnerable to blackmail. And the theory is, this is like wacko conspiracy theory stuff like me, is that Scalia was actually the top of all that, how all that works.
And that's you think the judiciary is not compromised, Richard? Or?
The judiciary is completely compromised.
Right.
Well, FBI is under the jurisdiction of judiciary. Sibyl Edmonds has been talking about Denny Hastert and that whole situation for many, many years. She's credible in all the other aspects of her research, so you have to listen to her and take it and investigate it for yourself. But what I can tell you is that the qualifications for being at the highest posts in government are that you have handles on you, meaning that you're blackmailable. For instance, as two adjacent instances that demonstrate that, Alan Dulles was under the control of British intelligence since 1916 when he got caught in a honey trap with a foreign spy who was stealing information from him, and they said, we can either put you in prison for espionage or you can play with us. And from there, he plays as an American working for the British intelligence through the Paris 1919 peace conference, through the creation of the CFR, through the funding of the Nazis, through the hiding of Rockefeller's Nazi money after the war, to Operation Gladio, to all the stuff that Kennedy fired him for. And then as an adjacent head of intelligence under the Justice Department, J. Edgar Hoover was highly blackmailable. He, according to a credible witness who worked for the Justice Department that I've interviewed on film, that he was blackmailable not because he was sleeping with foreign spies, but because he was sleeping specifically with British male spies from MI6. And that was what allowed J. Edgar Hoover to maintain his position in FBI without that coming to the American public's notice. So that's not my opinion. That's testimony that I took from an attorney who worked for the Justice Department and became a whistleblower. And I have 5 hours of footage with him. So it's not out of context.
What's his name?
John Loftus.
This is, I knew that, we're going to talk to Rich. Glenn, did I tell you my man Richard Grove's got skills or what?
He's got some game for sure.
So this is, it's turned out to be a good starting point. See, I didn't want, just to say, here's some videos and go off and, make up all kinds, and it's based on not real journalism that you go, okay, so who is this guy? What's the context that he's gotten there and the influence of and his connections with, and it goes back, God, over a century, hell, probably longer, centuries. This is forever and always kind of crap. And this method is not new, but it's to what end? What it's always been. Tomorrow, the world. I mean, these guys are messed up in the head. And whatever your opinion is, they definitely are not of the opinion that you have self-determination. You're just a cog in a larger machine of whatever the hell they want to do, and because they love you, they're doing it for your own benefit.
No, Ernie. Listen,
whatever the argument is, it doesn't matter.
The actual situation is, this is a factory for producing children for sacrifice and murder. The rest of everything else you're talking about is a detail of how you manage the factory. The key is the purpose of all of this is to manufacture children for ritual abuse, sacrifice, and torture, because this occult believes, and maybe it's true, I don't know, gives them longevity or this, that, or the other. That's what's going on. All this other crap you're talking about is
to protect
detail
that.
of how they manage to control people.
Well, it's not just the control mechanism to be able to get government and rule the planet. You're saying that the positions of power to planet is to cover up them having their children sacrificed.
Yes.
Damn. Well, either way, it's bad. They're bad.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
It just kind of colors it a little bit differently.
All right. Damn. All right. So before we go, Richard, Trump. Man, what can we look from Trump? He gonna blaze a trail out of it, drain the swamp so we can find the swamp monster and put a lance through his heart? What?
Not any more than Hillary Clinton was going to. I mean, he's got neocons, Rhodes Scholars, Kissinger acolytes. He's filling his cabinet with the dregs of our society, and he doesn't seem to have a clue of the agenda of Cecil Rhodes and the British Empire's desire to make America the spearhead on their empire that was collapsing under its own weight. So instead of embracing the facts that we have and the evidence and artifacts, he said, let's take the people who follow the will of Cecil Rhodes and put them into power so this can happen faster. So he brings in, James Woolsey, who is director CIA, DCI under Clinton administration, who's a Rhodes Scholar and is part of the Jamestown Foundation that has ties to the Boston bombing. And he says, hey, let's bring in Catherine McFarlane, who is also part of the Jamestown Foundation and is an acolyte of Henry Kissinger, who was trained by Rhodes Scholar William Yandell Elliott. And then when you look at some of these other emails, they tie back to Brzezinski, who was also mentored by Rhodes Scholar William Yandell Elliott. So these guys are fully embracing the Anglo-American establishment's plan to use America and throw it away, to sully its good nature and integrity that was left over from the 20th century and make sure it gets flushed down the drain. So it's not good. I mean, you could have had the wife of Rhodes Scholar Bill Clinton in there running things. It was going to be the same result. Right foot or left foot, it's connected to the same body. And people who believe that Trump's not connected to that body politic are nescient or willingly
Well, he
ignorant.
went to Pedophile Island. We have the whole. That's the problem.
Yeah, he did.
He's connected to Epstein.
He's good friends. Yeah, he's good friends with Epstein. Epstein had like 14 different numbers to reach Trump in his book, in his logs. There's the Lolita Express flight logs. There's Epstein down at Mar-a-Lago at Trump's resort. There's Epstein under oath saying, I plead the fifth with respect to knowledge of Trump. So just because Bill Clinton went there 26 times, 13 times without Secret Service detail doesn't mean that he's that far removed from a billionaire, because the whole thing is, once you have so much money and the rules don't apply to you, that makes your actions very similar to a sociopath or psychopath. That's just the facts of what money does. And that's why my book is on the banking family that prints this money out of nothing in order to control human nature.
I'm not sure we want to stick with that. I don't think that's necessarily true at all. I think if you have, we know people that have $1 billion, and I tell you what, they're not. I mean, they couldn't possibly be more unlike what we're talking about here.
Yeah, well, I just speak from I haven't bumped into those people yet. Otherwise, I'd have more resources at my beck and call to do something about this situation. And I have the opinion that people who stand by and watch this evil go on and don't do anything about it, kind of participate in it. That's how evil happens.
No. I'm not saying. I'm just saying what we don't want to do is equate $1 billion with being a psychopath.
Absolutely not. There are people, I'm sure, who break that rule, and I'd like to meet some of those people.
Yeah, and them fund your stuff.
I got some good news for them.
We can probably help you out.
Yeah. All right, no, Richard's he's being introduced at this very moment. This is I'm wanting to make sure that there is a right path in the investigation, because I've seen this happen before, and it always turns into a book. There's a generation next that understands and then it's gone. And it's out of sight. It's buried. And to think that the internet is the end all be all and some archive of something isn't always true. Now, let me ask Mr. NSA here. When you put something on the internet, does that mean it's always there somewhere for something, or can things be stricken? We had published a few days ago the delete everything about me button on the internet kind of thing. So I'm just going.
You've heard of Bluffdale, Utah?
What, NSA's thing?
Yeah, so the answer now, whether we can get it, I just want to make the point that for one thing, I can guarantee you that it's in there. So now whether it's available elsewhere, I don't know. So the answer to your question is, if something's on the internet, is it there forever? Is absolutely yes. Can you find it? It's harder.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you access it? That's the question.
That's what I mean. Access it. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at the next stage.
Cut off the water to Bluffdale.
Yeah.
Right.
What a joke, man.
If they can't cool it, they can't preserve it.
That'll happen until it gets too real, and then somebody will disappear, and that'll be the end of that shit.
That's just they're just raising money. Okay, now the next stage one. It's probably to all of our advantage that Richard's going back in his hole to finish up what he's doing on Rothschilds, which is kind of a foundation to a lot of this stuff anyway. He might even color a little bit of the coverage, or what you're writing.
I was almost done with the book till they came out with these Podesta emails, and there's Lynn Rothschild writing, "I miss you" emails to Hillary. I'm like, oh, I'm glad I didn't go to publish yet.
Yeah, I got more stuff. There's a couple more chapters here. Okay.
Tons more. I got a whole new first chapter, yeah.
God,
this is kind of fucked with my schedule a bit, too.
Okay, so
I basically had to have friends come over yesterday because I shouldn't say anything. Never mind. Sorry, I'm being a dick. Never mind.
Okay, Richard, you're looking at how long before you think you're going to be ready to go, assuming another bombshell doesn't blow up in front of you. But I mean, you're going to go to press with this when, and who's going to publish? You going to self-publish? You got a publisher or what?
No, I'm going to self-publish. I explored publishers, and then I have friends that self-publish, and they're like, you could sell 80% less books and still make more money.
Exactly.
And have total control over your product, and I could revise it anytime I want. So I'm going to go to print in the next couple months. That way it just gets out there, and if I need to do a second edition, then I'll do a second edition. It's changing a couple files, uploading a couple files, and then that's it.
Are you going to go to print, or is it going to be online book?
No, it's going to be like a hard copy print.
How much are you going to charge?
I don't know. It remains to be seen.
$150 a book, but I get one free. I want you to charge as much as possible so that my free one's worth more.
There you go.
And well, of course, we'll promote the living crap out of it and banner ads all over the site and everything. So this is, that's good. I'm glad that this started. Well, we're going to let you get back to it because I want to make sure that it gets done. And you're looking, what, a couple of months, you said? A month or what?
Yeah, I'd like to have it done by the end of January and have it done off my plate because I got other projects. I got a ton of, I went to D.C. and filmed 6 different interviews with, foreign policy experts, ex-CIA people, whistleblowers down there. And I haven't had a chance to even look at that footage yet. And I can't until I get this book done. So I got tons of stuff to do.
All right, don't get distracted. I mean, everybody want to distract you. That'd be their goal and be a flame war of the Twitter of we don't like Richard. And you just got to go, hey, man, writing a book. Suck it,
I'll just be like, wait and see.
Yeah. Well, you got to be willing to do that. I know how you are. You're like, I'm gonna get this guy. I know that's what sucks people into their Facebook.
Yeah, Twitter, I'm not into drama, man. That's why I'm not even on Facebook. I'm not into that. I'm into publishing the evidence and artifacts that exist because it helps people now and more importantly into the future. This is stuff that people in the future, they're literally dying because they don't have this information, until we do something about it, it continues to get worse and manifest in much more egregious ways than it's ever manifested in history.
All right. Now, Glenn, if you're, sending anything to, me and or Richard, it's going to meet this level of scrutiny. I'm hoping that you understand that.
Dude.
So don't be wasting time saying, this guy said, don't mean shit, because it's going to be, because I don't even repeat a lot of it. I'll put it, I don't validate anything, where Richard does. I don't even have an opinion. I just have Richard come on and tell us all about it. But the thing is because I go to the end. Richard and I have had this discussion for years. My thing is I'm going, now I understand everything, now what? I'm already at the end. I know they, them, those are ones won't leave me alone. Evil, pointy tail people that want.
But now what is make media so other people understand? So you have strength in numbers, and it's not just a couple disparate people with an understanding.
No. I think it's very valuable what you do. I know it's very necessary. But for me,
we do every day.
It's such an. I mean, I got kids and grandkids and stuff and things doing everything. I'm going, whatever. Skip to the end. It's a general opinion. What is the general opinion? Well, I don't know, but that's what they're always trying to control. And when you have guys from the head of the BBC, covering up child sex scandals that go to the Crown, and then all of a sudden he's CEO of the New York Times, you just go, what the fuck? Is that a minimum job requirement? It seems like it is. You can't be you sure as shit can't be president unless what? There's something that they, them, those got, or they're just going to take you out. You know, so, I mean, you don't think so? What the hell you think happened with Reagan and Daddy Bush? So I'm just going, this is, man, some weird shit. So what do we know about Pence? Is he, decent guy, another one of the bad guys, a plant guy, backup guy of the guy? What?
Yeah, all I know is that he doesn't get there in that position, like, one shot away from being president for doing good things.
Yeah.
None of these people matter. None of these people. So again, if you start thinking this way, you're going to get lost. First, no politician has anything to do with the running of the country. We've known that forever, but I'm telling you that's true. This is going on. This is back. So I don't know. It's possible. So let me get. So again, this is me. It's possible that basically this group who decided to go all the way, right? Because this is all or nothing, right? Somehow managed to tell Trump a story about what they're going to do, and Trump somehow indicated that he would be okay with that or whatever. Who the fuck knows? I'm just telling you. And that's why he got in, and that's why all of this stuff is happening, in my view. So it smells to me, because it smells to me like this is serious shit going on way, way, way behind the scenes. And that's why Trump's there. It's not Trump the person that matters, because the people that let him get there are what matter. That's who we have to. That's what I am focusing on.
All right, I'm very. You know them by their fruits, and it's going to be very quickly. We're going to find one through the appointments, two through the initial first day of he does whatever, and then it's going to be the 90-day, 100 days of we're going to what gets passed and so on, and then amongst all of that, what happens with the children? What about the swamp monster? Then what? And if there's nothing, give them some time. Screw that crap. There's going to be a swamp draining or not, and, take a headshot on the swamp monster or not. And I'm going, it's very simple for me, because I've been doing this a long time, and I see how this issue, this child pedophilia, ring, control, worship of whatever the heck, and kind of it's been uncovered. We got Alex Jones out there, the Bohemian Grove stuff, bringing that to popular awareness. We got all of these different scandals and books by, politicians and experts and journalists. It's all there. And then all of a sudden, who makes the tie-in of this is all part of the same thing? Guys like Richard Grove, other authors, John Taylor Gatto, G. Edward Griffin. They're going to be here this Saturday. We're going to be doing a thing with Griffin. And I'm going, yep, it's not a secret. But what I think is a secret is just how it's not a secret. And I'm going,
right.
Where are we going to go with
this? That's the occult mocking, right? So basically a concept that you'll see is they do it. So why would these people do all this cheeky, weird shit, like putting the pedophile symbol on the pizza logo, right? You know that whole thing? It's the concept, the term is called occult mockery. This is like, they love this shit. They love to do it because they're evil and they think it's funny. And you don't have to believe that. I'm just telling you that's going to end up being true. And that's why this particular effort is being so successful, because now that people know to look for that shit, they're finding shit everywhere.
There was a, if you go on Google Earth, I can pull it up, but it was, the symbol was at the top of a marquee of a large, nice mall here near Arrowhead, Arizona, between where I'm at and Sun City up there. And after I saw this symbol, it was like kind of the double triangle circle thing. And I go, wow, that looks a lot like that. And I go, and I have my granddaughter with me. We were just out shopping, doing something. This is just a few days ago. And I go, let's go in there. I go in, I look for this symbol. Where did that symbol come from? I went to the company that owned it. Where'd that symbol? Why did they use that symbol? Nothing. It's just like I don't know, pedophiles should shop here or something. I mean, what the heck? And you could go down these rabbit holes, and I'm just like, yeah, you start seeing this stuff everywhere. So I don't know. That's why, Richard. Hey, thanks for coming on, guys.
Right.
I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Richard?
No, I was just listening, man.
All right. Well, all right. So we'll leave Richard alone until he finishes, the background, the kind of the Rothschild today and they and them, those, and put it out, and we'll pump the crap out of that book and everything, and hopefully you keep, doing what you're doing. And Glenn, I'm glad that we had an opportunity to talk with you. If you're going to go down this road, hopefully you learned something from, Richard, myself, of, how best to, I need the history on everything. Don't get names mixed up. Just because somebody said in a document, that don't mean nothing. You got to go and you got the skills, do some real research and make sure of the connection. And that TNH brain up there, you can see how useful that could be for you.
Yep.
All right, cool. Peace, brothers. Thank you very much for coming on. It's been real. I'll talk to you guys later.
Yep. All right, right on.
Bye.
You guys have a good day. Peace.